Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this presentation intended to provide a little bit more information about the revenue streams that are used to comprise the school budget. So when I say New York State school aid, there's a number of school aids. There's transportation aid, there's building aid, there's special education aid. There's a number of aids that all come together to be one New York State aid. The most important component is what's called foundation aid. That's the foundational amount of resources that needs to be put forward by the state, given the state's expectations to provide a sound basic education. So that foundation aid is what we'll talk about the most. And what I also want to touch upon is to just kind of share with people some of the information about how New York State has unfortunately not a great track record when it comes to a reputation or a practice, maybe not even a reputation, a practice of equitable funding. New York State is famously challenged to provide equitable funding. This year is the closest we've come, the current year that we're currently in. So you can see in foundation aid, so this is a large amount of money. So you can see where Avon lies. These 22 bar graphs represent all of the districts in the Genesee Valley BOCES, and each one of them gets a foundation aid allotment from New York State. And you can see Avon is down here, third lowest in terms of the number of students we have and the amount of foundation aid provided from the state of New York. So we're, in terms of districts, only 2 in our region receive less money per student than we do here at Avon. And unfortunately, that's been a trend, a long-standing pattern that Avon has been underfunded by New York State. So this is quite a bit of a difference between those that are the most funded and where we find ourselves at just under $10,000, with some schools being at $15,000, approaching $15,000 over here to the right, or even approaching $20,000 at the far right of the graph. This is not to disparage or disrespect our colleagues in the Genesee Valley BOCES. Instead, it's just to provide a snapshot of where we stand in terms of the total revenues that come into the district. I mentioned New York State's history of inequitable funding. This goes back to a lawsuit that was started in 1993 by a group, the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. They first filed the lawsuit in 1993. Then in 2007, it was finally settled that a solution needed to be put in place, and a solution was adopted. The solution was a new foundation aid formula that would drive more funds to schools on an equitable basis, and it was going to be phased in over 4 years. It was paused. There was a pretty significant recession in around 2008, 9, 10, and the state took a while to get back on its feet. So the 4-year implementation period was never met, and as a result, we continued to go underfunding, and I have a graph later that'll explain some of that. This current year is the first year of full funding. So 31 years after the initial lawsuit was the first year that New York State fully funded its own foundation aid formula to provide a sound basic education in New York. This year, and before this year ended, there were changes and adjustments made to the foundation aid formula by the governor and her budget office. And these were done without a lot of conversation from the field. None of us, in fact, expected that they were going to come. So the formula now calculates slightly less money for Avon, but it's been tinkered with in non-transparent ways. However, the final budget will give us the same amount of aid for 24-25 as we have this year. So we're not losing any funding in the end, but we're also not going up when we know we're facing a 4.1% consumer price index. Makes it challenging to build a school budget. I mentioned the history of inequitable funding from New York State. So going back to the 07-08, when the formula needed to be fixed and there was supposed to be this 4-year phase-in period, what these bar graphs show is the monies that we were supposed to receive. The total amount isn't shown, but that would be the top of the graph. With the graphs coming below, that is all of the funds in each of these years that we did not receive. New York State's formula was calculated, the formula was run for Avon, and then we did not get this amount of money on each of these years. So as you move farther to the right, it gets a little bit better. And you can see in 23-24, this current year, there's no deficit. We have no deficit this year because it's the first and only year that the foundation aid formula was fully funded. In total, up until this point, we've lost or not been funded about $24 million that New York State's own formula calculates for the Avon School District. $24 million is approximately our school budget for 1 year, and it's the state's portion of our school budget for nearly 2 years. You can see in 24-25, we're showing a little bit of a deficit. This is, I need to explain this a little bit. So in all of these years where we were underfunded, roughly half of the districts in our region were being overfunded by various amounts. So as we were not getting the standard amount, some districts, local and across the state, were actually getting more than what the formula was calculating. So instead of taking monies from these folks, as Robin Hood might have done, to balance the formula, to balance the resources earlier, New York State just kept it going. And when we were bringing up the standard over the last 2 years, those districts that were already overfunded were being given 3% due minimum. So a recognition that some of the costs are going up, that some additional resources are needed from the state. So they got not only above their formula foundation aid calculation, but 3% on top of that. So one would think that without any conversation in November, December, that this same pattern might apply to the coming school year, but that switched. The aid was, the foundation aid formula was changed, and we're working very hard to try to advocate for a strong and purposeful look at what that foundation aid formula calculates and what does it truly cost to educate a student in New York State in 2025. But right now, we have to live with a tinkered formula. However, I'm counting that while other districts for all of these years got 3% guaranteed every year, the first year we're fully funded, Avon once again just is held even and does not get any 3%. So I would consider that a approximate 3% of a reduction in our aid, or about $330,000 is what 3% would have been had we received the due minimum like all of our own overfunded colleagues have received. So pretty substantial here. That's why there's this asterisk, and I'm calling this out. So I want to make sure that I'm trying to be clear about the history here of resources that New York State itself calculated. New York State itself said Avon should get to provide an education in New York State, and then we did not receive those funds. We're not alone. This happened across the state. It's roughly half the districts being overfunded, half being underfunded, and the amounts vary. Within our region, Avon is among the most underfunded of our 22 schools, of those who have traditionally been underfunded.